By the autumn of 1944, German tank crews fighting in the Lorraine region of eastern France had learned a new rule of the battlefield. If a small, high-winged aeroplane appeared in the sky overhead, you did not laugh at it. You did not even fire at it. You started your engine. You dispersed off the road. You took cover. Because in the moments after that little airplane appeared, the world around you would be replaced by something that veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, said they had never experienced before. The plane was a Piper L4 Grasshopper. It was 65 horsepower. It was built of steel tubing and doped cotton fabric. It carried no bombs. It carried no machine guns. Its engine sounded like a lawnmower in the distance. And when one of them circled slowly over a German position, what followed was almost never a bomb or a bullet from the plane itself. What followed was a wall of artillery fire, so accurate, so massive, and so sudden that the men on the receiving end called it the Hammer of God. This is the story of how a small civilian sport plane, derived from a pre-war trainer that cost a third of the price of a Cadillac, became the most feared aircraft in the United States Army, not because of what it could do to the enemy, because of what it could see. The Piper L4 Grasshopper began its life as the J-3 Cub, a small two-seat trainer designed before the war for civilian flight schools. It cost roughly $1,300 new in 1940. It had a single Continental 01-70 engine, producing 65 horsepower. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. Its top speed was 85. A strong headwind could nearly hold it stationary in the air. It was so light that two men could lift the tail and turn it around on the ground without effort. The fuselage was a frame of welded steel tubes covered with doped cotton fabric. The wings were built around spruce wood spars. The landing gear was held in place by bungee cords. It carried no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It had no radio when the army first bought it. It had no weapons of any kind. By all the rules of military aviation in 1941, this should have been a useless aircraft. The world was watching the Battle of Britain. It was reading reports of Stuka dive bombers in Poland. It was building 4-engine heavy bombers and high-altitude pursuit fighters. The age of the small, slow airplane seemed to be over before the war had truly begun. And yet, by the end of 1945, the United States Army would build more than 5,400 Grasshoppers. They would fly in every theater of the war. They would direct artillery fire that fell on German and Japanese troops with a precision no other system in the world could match. They would land on highways, beaches, cow pastures, golf courses, and the decks of LSTs. They would carry generals into combat zones, evacuate the wounded, deliver penicillin to surrounded paratroopers in the Ardennes, and on one remarkable April afternoon in 1945, 2 of their pilots would shoot down a German plane using nothing but their service pistols. But to understand why the Germans came to dread the sight of these tiny planes, we have to go back to a problem the United States Army had been trying to solve for almost 20 years, the problem of seeing the battlefield. In World War I, artillery had become the single greatest killer on the battlefield. By most estimates, it was responsible for roughly 2/3 of all combat deaths. But artillery was only effective when the gunners knew where their shells were landing. In the trenches of France, that meant either a forward observer crawling through the mud with a telephone wire, or a man hanging in the basket of a tethered observation balloon, watching for the puffs of smoke that marked each shell. Both methods had terrible weaknesses. The forward observer could only see what was in his immediate line of sight. The balloon was a slow, gigantic target that German fighters loved to attack. After the war, the United States Army Air Service took over the observation mission with biplane aircraft. By the 1930s, those aircraft had grown larger and faster. They flew higher. They were operated by Air Corps pilots, who answered to Air Corps commanders, not to the artillery officers on the ground. And there was a problem. The observation aircraft had become too fast and too high to do the job. A pilot at 4,000 feet, traveling at 150 miles per hour, could not see the splash of a single artillery round in a wooded ravine. By the time the radio call reached the gunners and the next round was fired, the pilot was 3 miles downrange. The system did not work. Field artillery officers complained for years. The Air Corps did not particularly care, because by the 1930s, the Air Corps had become obsessed with strategic bombing, with the long-range 4-engine bomber that would, in theory, win wars by itself. Spotting for cannons was beneath them. In the summer of 1941, with the United States not yet in the war but watching it with growing alarm, the Army staged the largest peacetime maneuvers in its history. The Louisiana maneuvers stretched across the swamps and pine forests of Louisiana and East Texas. Some 400,000 to 500,000 soldiers participated. They tested doctrines, equipment, and leaders, and quietly, almost as an afterthought, 3 small American aircraft manufacturers offered the Army an experiment. Piper, Aeronca, and Taylorcraft together loaned the Army around a dozen civilian sport planes, free of charge, with civilian pilots. The Army was free to use them, however it wished. The artillery officers on the ground knew exactly how they wanted to use them. For weeks, those small planes flew over the maneuver area. They carried artillery officers in the back seat. They flew low, sometimes only 200 feet above the trees. They had short-wave radios borrowed from the field. They spotted simulated enemy positions, called fire missions, adjusted rounds, and demonstrated the same thing over and over again. A small, slow airplane, flown by a man who actually understood artillery, could direct fire faster, more accurately, and more reliably than any other system the Army had ever tested. According to industry and Army accounts of the period, the planes together flew roughly 400,000 miles and conducted around 3,000 missions during the maneuvers without losing a single airplane. It was during one of these summer exercises, at the desert maneuvers near Fort Bliss, Texas, that a moment occurred which gave these planes their name. A Piper Cub flown by a company pilot named Henry Won landed hard on a rough strip in front of Major General Innis P. Swift, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division. The little plane bounced several times before settling. According to several slightly different versions of the story, Swift remarked that the airplane looked just like a damn grasshopper when it landed out there in the boondocks and bounced around. The exact words are uncertain. The nickname stuck. From that day forward, the little planes were called grasshoppers. But getting the Army to actually adopt them as standard equipment took a fight. The Army Air Forces, under General Henry Hap Arnold, opposed the idea fiercely. Arnold believed that everything that flew belonged to him, that the Air Corps should control all aviation, that giving aircraft to the artillery branch was a violation of the principle of unified air power. One Air Forces officer reportedly wrote in a memo to his superiors that they should let the ground forces have the airplanes, because the ground forces would soon learn their lesson and beg to give them back. Standing against Arnold was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the commander of the Army Ground Forces, a man who had no time for inter-service rivalries when there was a war to fight. McNair sided with the artillery. So did the Chief of Field Artillery, Major General Robert M. Danford. So did then Brigadier General George S. Patton, who happened to be a licensed light plane pilot himself. So did Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, who also flew Cubs in his off-duty time. On June 6, 1942, 2 years to the day before the landings at Normandy, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson signed the directive that established organic aviation for the field artillery. Each artillery battalion was authorized 2 airplanes, 2 pilots, and 1 mechanic. The airplanes belonged to the artillery, not the air forces. The pilots were artillery officers first and pilots second. They wore the silver wings of a liaison pilot, but they carried the crossed cannons of the artillery branch. That same day, the Department of Air Training was established at Post Field, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Its first commander was Lieutenant Colonel William Wallace Ford, a quiet, methodical artilleryman who would come to be remembered as a founder of modern Army aviation. 2 months later, on August 1, 1942, the first class arrived. There were 19 students. Among them were Captain Joseph M. Watson, Jr., who had flown some of the very first artillery spotting demonstrations in a Piper Cub during the pre-war maneuvers of 1940 and 1941, Captain Robert R. Williams, who would one day retire as a lieutenant general and be remembered as one of the founding fathers of Army aviation, and Captain Delbert Bristol, who would serve as a senior aviation officer in the European theatre. By the time the program was operating at full strength, the school at Fort Sill was producing pilots by the thousands. Each one trained for short-field landings on terrain that would have terrified a civilian pilot. Each one learned to land in less than 300 feet, take off in less. Each one learned aerial photography, navigation by dead reckoning, and the brutal art of remaining alive while flying slowly over an enemy who was very much trying to kill him. The mechanics trained for hundreds of hours. They learned to keep an airplane flying with whatever materials they could find. They became as essential to the mission as the pilot himself. The first combat test of the program came on November 9, 1942. Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of French North Africa. 3 Piper L-4 Grasshoppers were lashed to the flight deck of the USS Ranger, an American fleet carrier. They were to be the first United States Army aircraft ever to launch from a warship in combat. The lead pilot was Captain Ford E. Alcorn. The launch was a disaster. The captain of the Ranger refused to break radio silence to inform the American Gunfire Support Task Force that 3 small, unfamiliar aircraft were about to take to the air. So when Alcorn's flight passed over the cruiser USS Brooklyn, the Brooklyn's crew could not find the silhouette of an L-4 in their aircraft recognition manuals. They opened fire. So did several other ships. The Cubs dove for the deck. They flew toward the beach. The American troops on the beach, who had also never seen a grasshopper, opened fire as well. Multiple machine gun rounds struck Alcorn's leg. He crash-landed in a French vineyard, becoming the first United States Army aviator wounded in combat in the Second World War. The other pilots came down behind Vichy French lines and were briefly captured. The third Cub reached its intended landing field, only to be shot at by every Allied unit it passed. It looked like the program was finished. General Arnold seized on the failure and demanded that artillery aviation be returned to the air forces. From his hospital bed, Captain Alcorn argued the opposite. He told McNair's staff that the airplanes had performed exactly as designed. The problem was not the airplanes. The problem was that no one had told the Navy and the Army that they were coming. McNair listened. He kept the program, and from that point onward, things changed. By the time the Allied armies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the Grasshoppers had become indispensable. By the time the beachhead at Anzio was holding on by its fingernails in early 1944, the L-4s circling overhead were the difference between survival and annihilation. From the cliffs above Anzio, German artillery observers on Monte Cassino could look down into every American foxhole. Every truck, every kitchen, every gun position was visible to them. The Allied answer was to put their own observers in the sky in Cubs, to level the playing field. When the L-4s were grounded by weather, men died. When the L-4s flew, the Germans hid. One of the pilots who flew through the entire Italian campaign and through almost every other major operation in the European theatre was a young lieutenant of the 3rd Infantry Division named Alfred Schultz. Known to everyone as Dutch, he flew an L-4B that he had named Janie after a girl back home. He had assembled the airplane himself, with the help of a sergeant, after it arrived in a packing crate. Janie would fly with the 3rd Infantry Division from Casablanca in late 1942 through North Africa, Sicily, the Italian peninsula, southern France, and into Germany. By VE Day, she had become widely cited as the only L-4 documented to have served the entire European war intact. She carried Lieutenant General Lucien Truscott on inspection flights, and on at least one occasion she taxied General George Patton himself. She was the longest-serving grasshopper in the war. Schultz would later write a memoir about her called Janie, A Little Plane in a Big War, and the airplane herself would survive the conflict and end up in a museum. In the hedgerow country of Normandy in the summer of 1944, the Grasshoppers came into their full, terrible power. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had built the Atlantic Wall to stop an invasion at the water's edge. He had not built it for what happened after. The Norman bocage was a maze of small fields divided by ancient earthen banks crowned with thick hedges. A German tank could be hidden behind any one of those hedges, invisible from 100 feet away on the ground. From 300 feet in the air, in a slow plane that could circle for an hour, the same tank was as obvious as a black beetle on a white tablecloth. By June and July of 1944, the United States First Army was losing roughly 49 spotting aircraft and 33 pilots in those 2 months alone. The casualties were horrific. The pilots flew anyway. They flew because they could see the war from a perspective no one else had. They flew because every fire mission they called, every target they marked, saved the lives of dozens of American infantrymen who would otherwise have had to take that hill, clear that village, attack that strongpoint with rifles and grenades. and they flew because of a simple, devastating piece of military mathematics. The United States Army had built, by 1944, the most sophisticated artillery system in the world. At its center was a method called the time-on-target fire mission. Multiple batteries of guns, sometimes a dozen, sometimes 2 dozen, sometimes the entire artillery park of an army corps, would calculate firing data so that all of their shells, fired from different ranges by different guns, would arrive at the same target within roughly a 3-second window. There was no warning whistle. There was no first round to take cover from. There was simply, in one instant, the hammer descending on the target. Hundreds of high explosive rounds in 3 seconds. Trees splintered to matchsticks. Tanks flipped onto their backs. Infantry caught in the open were not wounded. They were erased. During Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps had 258 non-divisional artillery pieces under its control, with a 5-day allocation of roughly 140,000 rounds of ammunition. Many of those rounds were directed by spotters in L-4 Grasshoppers, flying at 1,000 feet, calling out targets they could see, watching the rounds land, adjusting fire, and calling for more. The Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the most powerful German armoured formations in France, was effectively destroyed within days. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, would describe the experience in language that combined the carpet bombing of July 25 with the relentless artillery that followed, calling the result a moonscape. The Germans understood, very quickly, what the little planes meant. They had no single nickname for them, but in their reports and orders they called them simply the small reconnaissance plane, the observer. They learned that firing on one was usually a mistake. The Cub was small and slow and easy to hit, but it was almost never alone. Its pilot was talking, constantly, to a radio net that connected him to dozens of guns. If a German anti-aircraft battery opened fire on a Grasshopper, the muzzle flashes were visible from the air. The pilot would mark the position. Within minutes, the battery would be a smoking hole. So the German batteries learned to hold their fire. The tank crews learned to dismount and disperse the moment they heard the engine note in the distance. Infantry columns scrambled into the ditches. Truck convoys pulled off the roads and waited, sometimes for hours, for the Cub to leave. A single L-4, flown by a single lieutenant with a map and a radio, could paralyze the movement of an entire German division. The historian Edgar F. Raines, in the official army history of this program, documented how the mere presence of a field artillery aircraft overhead became an effective counter-battery tool in itself. German batteries learned to hold their fire, lest their muzzle flashes bring forth a rain of Cub-directed shells. The retired director of the Fort Sill Museum, Tawana Spivey, put it more starkly. The enemy referred to these spotting planes as harbingers of death, he said, because when they appeared in the sky, the men on the ground knew that artillery fire would soon follow. In September 1944, that truth was demonstrated in one of the largest tank battles ever fought between Americans and Germans. The Battle of Aracourt began on September 18 and lasted through September 29. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, with around 260 tanks and assault guns, including the new Panther and Panzer IV tanks of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, attacked the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's 3rd Army. The fighting took place in cold autumn fog that often grounded the larger fighter bombers of the 19th Tactical Air Command. But the L-4s, slower and lower, continued to fly. By the time the battle ended, the Germans had lost roughly 200 tanks and assault guns out of the force they had committed. Only a fraction of the original German armor was still operational. The Americans had won what would later be recognized as one of the most lopsided armored victories of the war. The German staff officer Friedrich von Mellenthin, who was serving in the senior command structure of Army Group G during the Lorraine fighting, he would write after the war that what struck him most about the campaign was the deadly effectiveness and flexibility of American artillery. He did not name the Grasshoppers. He did not have to. Every artilleryman on both sides understood who had made that effectiveness possible. And it was during the Battle of Aracourt that one American pilot turned the Grasshopper into something its designers had never imagined. Major Charles Carpenter was 32 years old. Before the war, he had been a high school history teacher and football coach in Moline, Illinois. He had a wife named Elda and a young daughter named Carol. He had been commissioned in the army, learned to fly the L-4 at Fort Sill, and shipped to Europe in the summer of 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division. Carpenter flew as an artillery liaison pilot under the division commander, Major General John Tiger Jack Wood, and on occasion taxied Wood between command posts. But most of his flying was the standard mission, finding targets and calling fire. He was, by every account from the men around him, a quiet and thoughtful man. He was also, by his own admission, somewhat unusual. In late summer of 1944, Carpenter began an experiment. He took two M1 bazookas, the standard American infantry anti-tank weapon, and bolted them onto the wing struts of his L-4. He named the airplane Rosie the Rocketer, painting the nose art himself, and ran the firing wires up to a toggle switch in the cockpit. Then he went looking for German tanks. He started with 2 bazookas. Then he added 2 more. Eventually, he was flying with 6. He fired them in shallow dives, aiming roughly down the airplane's nose, pulling out at maybe 100 meters from the target. The bazooka rocket was never designed to be fired from an aircraft. The aerodynamics were wrong. The accuracy was poor. Most of his shots missed. Some of them did not. Over the course of the autumn campaign, Carpenter was officially credited with destroying or immobilizing 6 German tanks, plus several armored cars, and a number of trucks and lighter vehicles. Most of his targets were Panthers and Panzer IV tanks, the standard German armor of the Lorraine fighting. Some popular accounts have added Tiger tanks to his tally, but the contemporary records of the 4th Armored Division do not unambiguously support that claim. On September 20, 1944, in the middle of the Aracourt battle, he flew at least 3 sorties, fired around 16 rockets, knocked out an armored car and several tanks, and helped break up an attack that had nearly overrun an American support unit. After the battle was over, his exploits made the front pages of Stars and Stripes and the Associated Press wire. They called him Bazooka Charlie. They called him the Mad Major. He did not seem to mind. He told a Stars and Stripes correspondent later that fall that word must be getting around to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. "Every time I show up now," he said, "they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." The reality was that Carpenter was not the only L-4 pilot doing this. Marines in the Pacific bolted bazookas onto their OY-1 Sentinels. Other Army pilots tried it in Europe. Most of them quickly went back to plane spotting after taking heavy ground fire. Carpenter just kept going. He once jumped onto the .50 caliber machine gun of a pinned-down American tank near Avranches and led an infantry charge on foot. He once landed his airplane near a destroyed German column, picked up a discarded rifle from the ground, and personally took 6 German prisoners. And then, sometime in late 1944 or early 1945, Carpenter began to feel sick. He did not say anything to anyone. He kept flying. He flew through the Battle of the Bulge, when the weather grounded most of the L-4 squadrons, but not him. He flew through the Rhine crossing. He flew until Germany surrendered. By the end of the war, he had been awarded the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. When he finally went to a military doctor in 1945, the diagnosis was Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system that doctors of the time often called Hodgkin's disease. They gave him 1 to 2 years to live. Carpenter went home anyway. He returned to teaching high school history, this time at Urbana High School in Urbana, Illinois. He almost never spoke of the war. His students knew vaguely that he had been some sort of pilot in Europe, but he did not boast. He read poetry. He kept his old uniforms in a closet and rarely took them out. Every year that he survived past his diagnosis was a quiet, unannounced miracle. He lived for 21 more years. He died on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53, in Champaign, Illinois, just a few miles from the high school where he had taught. The Urbana High yearbook that year was dedicated to him. Rosie the Rocketer was left behind in Europe in 1946 and sold to an Austrian buyer. She passed through several owners, was repainted yellow, was registered under an Austrian civil identification, and ended up in an aviation museum in Graz. There, she sat for decades, unrecognized. In October 2017, a researcher working with the Collings Foundation in Massachusetts identified her by her serial number. She was bought, shipped back to the United States, and restored to her exact wartime appearance. The original nose art was repainted by Carpenter's granddaughter, Erin Patter, the daughter of Carol Carpenter Apaki. Today, Rosie the Rocketer flies again. She is based at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. Every October, she takes to the sky as part of the museum's reenactment events, 8 decades after she fired her last bazooka rocket at a German tank in Lorraine. Carpenter was the most famous L-4 pilot of the war. He was not the strangest. That distinction may belong to 2 young lieutenants of the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armored Division. On the morning of April 11, 1945, with the war in Europe almost over, First Lieutenant Merritt Dwayne Francis and his observer, Lieutenant William S. Martin, were flying a routine mission near the town of Dannenberg, Germany, about 100 miles west of Berlin. Francis was on his 142nd combat sortie. His airplane was an L-4H named Miss Me, with an exclamation point and a question mark in the painted name, because he wanted the German gunners to miss when they fired at him, and he hoped someone back home would miss him while he was away. Below them, on the road, Francis saw a German military column. Above them, at about 700 feet, he saw something he had never seen in the air. A Fieseler 156 Storch, a German light reconnaissance plane that was, in many ways, the German equivalent of his own Cub. It was a slow, fabric-covered, high-winged spotter that did exactly the same job for the Wehrmacht that Francis did for the Americans. Francis climbed above the Storch. He keyed his radio. "We are about to give combat," he said. He pushed the throttle forward. Both men opened the side cabin doors of the Cub. Both men drew their Colt M1911 45 caliber service pistols. Francis dove. As he closed on the Storch, both Americans began emptying their pistols at the German plane. Bullets struck the Storch's windscreen, its right wing, its fuel tank. They reloaded as fast as they could. The Storch began to spin. It crashed into a field below. Francis landed the Cub in the same field. The 2 German crewmen, one of them wounded in the foot, tried to run. Martin fired a warning shot from his pistol. They surrendered. Francis, who was carrying a small first aid kit, knelt down and bandaged the wounded German's foot. Then he flagged down a passing 5th Armored Division tank crew, handed over the prisoners, took the German pilot's insignia as a souvenir, and flew back to base. He had just become one of the very few American pilots in the entire Second World War to bring down an enemy aircraft using only a handgun. The Army recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The recommendation was lost in the chaos of the war's end. Francis went home, returned to civilian life, and assumed that was the end of it. It was not. In 1966, the writer Cornelius Ryan published a book about the fall of Berlin called The Last Battle. The story of Francis and Martin and their pistols was in it. A United States senator named Henry Scoop Jackson read the book. Jackson took up Francis' case personally. On March 13, 1967, 22 years after the event, Major General Walter Jensen presented First Lieutenant Merritt Dwayne Francis with the Distinguished Flying Cross at Holman Field, St. Paul, Minnesota. There is another story from the winter of 1944 that is worth telling, because it shows the other side of what these airplanes could do. In the 3rd week of December, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war in the West, the surprise attack through the Ardennes that the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge. For the first week of the offensive, heavy overcast and snow grounded almost all Allied air activity. The fighter bombers that had ruled the skies over France could not fly. The strategic bombers could not see their targets. American ground forces, including the 101st Airborne Division surrounded at Bastogne, were cut off and on their own. The L-4 pilots flew anyway. They flew lower than the cloud ceiling. They flew through snow squalls. They flew with frostbitten fingers wrapped around throttles. Among them was First Lieutenant Kenneth Baker Schley Jr., an artillery liaison pilot serving with the 28th Infantry Division, which had been shattered in the opening days of the German offensive. On Christmas Eve 1944, Schley flew the now famous penicillin run into the surrounded perimeter at Bastogne, landing in a field cleared by paratroopers and taking off again with wounded men crammed behind him. He was awarded the Silver Star for that flight. He was not the only Grasshopper pilot who flew supply missions in those dark days. The L-4 was not designed as a medical evacuation aircraft. It had no stretchers, no oxygen, no insulation against the cold. The wounded sat or lay where they could fit, often on the floor of the cabin. Several pilots lost fingers to frostbite. Some did not return. When the skies finally cleared on December 23, the larger fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force returned to the battlefield, and the German offensive began to disintegrate under massive Allied air and artillery attack. But during the dark week before the weather broke, the only aircraft over the front were the L-4s, doing the work that no other aircraft could do. In the Pacific Theater, the Grasshoppers fought a different war. They flew from coral airstrips and jungle clearings. They lived under their wings, refueled from jerry cans, and ate K rations for months at a time. They flew in tropical heat that warped wood and rotted fabric. Japanese infiltrators specifically targeted the L-4 landing strips. According to the Army's official history of the program, on Luzon alone, the 6th Army lost 12 airplanes to enemy action, of which 8 were destroyed by Japanese soldiers who had crawled through the jungle in the dark to reach the strips. But what the Pacific Airmen accomplished was extraordinary. On Bougainville, Army aviation made its Pacific combat debut in late 1943 with elements of the Americal and 37th Infantry Divisions, learning to operate in jungle conditions where almost no aircraft maintenance support existed. In the Philippines, L-4s and L-5 Sentinels supplied the 11th Airborne Division behind enemy lines, dropping rations and ammunition until the larger transports could reach them. They became known to the paratroopers as biscuit bombers because crates of food were sometimes dropped without parachutes to save weight, and would slam into the ground hard enough to send up a cloud of dust. The most ingenious adaptation of the war was conceived by an Army captain named James H. Brodie, who had been born in Minneapolis in 1916 and trained as an engineer at the University of Minnesota. Brodie wanted to know how to launch and recover grasshoppers from a moving ship. He wanted to do it without a flight deck. He proposed stretching a 300-foot steel cable suspended around 50 feet above the deck of an LST tank landing ship between 2 cargo booms. An L-4 with a special hook mounted above its cabin could snag the cable while landing, slow itself on a trolley brake, and come to a stop. For takeoff, the airplane would accelerate down the cable until flying speed. The system was tested in 1943 at Moisant Field, near New Orleans, and at sea aboard a merchant cargo ship called the City of Dalhart. The test pilot, Raymond Gregory, performed the original successful sea trial hookups and was later decorated for his work on the system. The Brodie system was used operationally at Iwo Jima, where Marine OE-1 Sentinels launched from an LST offshore, and again at Okinawa in April 1945, where roughly 25 launches and recoveries were conducted by Army L-4s from the same ship. Brodie and Gregory both received the Legion of Merit. An L-5 with a complete Brodie cable rig is on display today at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. By the end of the Second World War, the United States Army had built more than 5,400 L-4 Grasshoppers, more than 3,500 L-5 Sentinels, more than 1,400 Leiters, 3 Defenders, and nearly 2,000 Leiter 2 Taylorcraft. They had served in every theater. They had flown reconnaissance missions, fire direction missions, courier missions, medical evacuation missions, and personal transport missions for nearly every senior commander in the European theater. General Dwight D. Eisenhower flew in them, and reportedly enjoyed taking an L-5 up for short flights to relax in the evenings. General Omar Bradley used them to inspect his front lines. General Patton was once attacked while flying in an L-5 by a Royal Air Force Spitfire pilot, reportedly Polish, who mistook the small American liaison plane for a German Storch, and whose Spitfire crashed when the pilot pulled out of his strafing run too low. The cost of all of this was real. In the European theatre alone, of more than 2,700 L-4s that served with the field artillery, nearly 900 were lost to enemy action or accidents. The casualties were small in comparison to the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, but they were borne by a small community of men who all knew each other, who had trained together at Fort Sill, who slept under the wings of their planes between missions, and who watched the empty cots in the field tents grow more numerous as the war went on. But the cost was paid against an extraordinary return. The little planes had transformed American artillery from a powerful but relatively blind weapon into the most accurate and responsive ground-based fire system on any battlefield in history up to that point. They had given the Field Artillery, an old and conservative branch of the Army, its own air force. They had proven a doctrine that the Army Air Forces had spent years insisting was impossible, that observation aviation should be controlled by the men who used the information, not by the men who flew the planes. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the Army was allowed to keep its small fixed-wing observation aircraft and its newly arrived helicopters. Through the Korean War, the helicopters proved themselves in the medical evacuation role, carrying wounded men out of forward positions in numbers that would have been unimaginable in the Second World War. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the helicopter became the dominant aircraft of Army aviation. The lessons learned on the steps of Bougainville and the bocage of Normandy carried directly into the air assault doctrine of Vietnam, and ultimately to the modern attack helicopters and utility helicopters that fly today. On April 12, 1983, General John Wickham, the United States Army Chief of Staff, signed General Order 6. With that signature, Army aviation became a basic branch of the United States Army, with its own commanders, its own school, and its own warrant officer corps. 41 years had passed since the day in June 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel William Wallace Ford had stood up the Department of Air Training at Fort Sill with 19 students and a few borrowed Piper Cubs. The branch he had founded, with no formal blessing and against the active opposition of the Army Air Forces, had become a permanent part of the United States military. Today, only a small number of L-4 Grasshoppers are still flying. They are scattered across museums and private collections in the United States and Europe. Each year, a smaller number of veterans gather to remember the men who flew them. Most of those veterans are now gone. The men who taxied Patton across French fields, who landed in Norman cow pastures with German machine gun bullets passing through their cotton wings, who dropped penicillin into the snow at Bastogne, who pursued a German Storch with .45 caliber pistols on a spring afternoon in 1945, have nearly all passed into history. The Grasshopper itself, the small, slow airplane that was supposed to be obsolete before the Second World War even began, outlived nearly every weapon system it served alongside. It outlived the Sherman tank in frontline American service. It outlived the Garand rifle in standard issue. It served in Korea. Some of its variants flew in Vietnam in the hands of Allied air forces. The Piper J-3 civilian airframe that gave it its bones is still flying today, on grass strips and in flight schools, 8 decades after the war. There is no monument on the National Mall to the men who flew the L-4 Grasshopper. There is no major Hollywood film about them. The Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama, the official Army Aviation Museum, displays them quietly, under glass, in halls that most American visitors walk through on the way to look at helicopters. The men who flew them did not write the kind of memoirs that became bestsellers. They did not see themselves as glamorous. They saw themselves as artillerymen who happened to have wings. But the Germans who fought them remembered. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded the German armies in Italy, wrote and spoke after the war about the extraordinary flexibility and accuracy of American artillery, which he said he had no answer for at any level of command. The veterans of the Lorraine fighting used almost identical language. Bayerlein blamed the destruction of his Panzer-Lehr division on a combination of American air power and an artillery system that struck him as something out of a different century. None of these German officers used the word grasshopper in their memoirs. They did not need to. The artillery they could not survive was being directed by something they could only barely shoot down. When a German tank crew in the autumn of 1944 heard the lawnmower hum of a Cub overhead, what they were actually hearing was something larger and stranger than the airplane itself. They were hearing a doctrine. They were hearing a young major from Illinois with bazookas on his wings. They were hearing 2 lieutenants with pistols. They were hearing a War Department directive signed in June 1942 by a Secretary of War, who had decided that the men who needed to see the battlefield should be the men who flew above it. The Grasshopper was the smallest, slowest, most fragile aircraft in the American inventory. It was also, measured by the weight of explosives it brought to bear on the enemy, among the most lethal. It could not carry a bomb. It did not need to. It could see. And in war, the side that sees first, sees clearest, and tells the cannons most quickly, is the side that wins. That is the story of the tiny planes the Germans came to hate, not because of what they did, because of what they meant. They meant that the war was no longer something you could hide from in the trees, or behind a hedge, or in the lee of a hillside. The men who flew the grasshoppers, the artillery officers who became pilots, and the mechanics who kept fabric and wood and steel tubing flying through machine gun fire and flak are the reason the United States Army learned that lesson, and the German Army did not. They are gone now, almost all of them. The airplanes are mostly silent. The skies over Lorraine and Normandy and Luzon are quiet. But somewhere, in a museum in Massachusetts, every October, a Piper L-4 named Rosie the Rocketer climbs into the air, 6 dummy bazookas mounted to her wings, and circles for a few minutes over the green New England fields. Below her, a small crowd looks up. They are not afraid. For one generation of German soldiers, on 100 battlefields across 2 continents, that was not always the case.